Today's video will take you into the hidden war behind the Eastern Front, where Soviet partisans fought a battle the maps rarely show, turning forests, rail lines, and occupied towns into a second front that the German war machine could never fully secure. Hidden Heroes of the Eastern Front is one of those stories people return to because it proves the war was not only decided by tanks and generals, but by ordinary men and women who refused to accept that occupation meant silence. In the last few years, as new archives, memoirs, and renewed debate have pushed the partisan war back into public conversation, one question keeps resurfacing: how much of the Eastern Front's outcome was shaped not at the front line, but behind it? What is at stake in this story is simple and brutal. When an army cannot trust its rear, even its victories at the front begin to rot from the inside. I remember the atmosphere of those years as a world holding its breath, with Europe shattered, borders rewritten by force, and entire nations living under ration cards, blackout curtains, and the constant arithmetic of survival. On the Eastern Front, the invasion did not just move armies, it tore societies open. Cities changed hands, villages fell under occupation, and between the front and the far horizon of the rear, people discovered that war could reach into the kitchen as easily as it reached into the trench. In that landscape, the partisans became something both feared and relied upon, because they operated where uniforms could not protect you, and where a single whispered warning could mean the difference between a raid and a massacre. They did not fight with the comfort of supply lines or the certainty of orders carried by couriers in daylight. They fought with what they could carry, what they could hide, and what they could learn, using sabotage, intelligence, and nerve to make the occupiers' routine collapse at the worst possible moments. And behind it all, there was a quieter struggle that belongs to the same era of secrecy and shadow work, the unseen contest of information, radio signals, coded messages, and hidden networks that stretched from forest camps to rail yards to distant headquarters, a wartime intelligence battle waged in whispers, not speeches. So as we begin, keep one thought close, because it will guide everything that follows. What if the partisan war had been organized earlier, supplied better, coordinated tighter, and aimed like a blade at the enemy's transport and reserves right when it mattered most? Come with me now into the woods and the occupied towns, into the places where the war did not announce itself with fanfare, where the fight was measured in delayed trains, severed wires, vanished patrols, and the stubborn refusal of the rear to stay quiet. Night in the western forests has its own language. It is not the speech of towns, or the polite quiet of villages. It is the hush that comes after a branch snaps and nobody breathes for a second. It is the faint metallic tick of a telegraph wire when the wind turns it, and the low, patient churn of distant transport on a road you cannot see. It is the sound a soldier hears when he has no uniform, no barracks, no safe rear, and yet he is still at war. If you want to understand the Eastern Front, you do not begin with the parade ground or the map room. You begin under the trees. That is where the first truth of 1941 was learned, not as a theory, but as a fact pressed into the body. The German invasion struck like a hammer in June, and what the hammer did not crush, it scattered. Armies broke into fragments. Whole divisions dissolved into streams of men moving east, moving north, moving nowhere at all. And in that scattering, something else was born. I can still remember how people spoke about it at first, almost like superstition. There are our men in the woods. The phrase carried comfort and fear at the same time. Comfort, because it suggested the war had not ended, even where the enemy planted his flags. Fear, because the woods are not a home. They are a test. Later, when the paperwork caught up and headquarters learned to name things, they called them detachments, groups, brigades. They issued numbers. They wrote directives. They drew lines on maps. But the beginning was simpler and crueler. The beginning was hunger and a rifle with 3 cartridges, and a decision made in a ditch behind a burning roadblock. Either you become a prisoner or you vanish. This is a story about those who vanished and kept fighting. And because you have asked for the hidden side, I will not pretend it was clean. In the forests and marshes, heroism and desperation lived in the same shelter. A partisan could rescue a family at dawn and execute an informant by dusk. A village could feed a unit 1 week and be punished the next. A commander could be brave and ruthless in the same sentence. When you see the movement properly, you see it as it was, a second front, improvised inside the enemy's rear, made of schoolteachers, miners, railwaymen, teenagers, escaped prisoners, Jews with nowhere else to go, and Red Army officers who refused to accept that being surrounded meant being finished. Now, before I take you into the operations, let me offer you the question that keeps returning, the one that turns this history into something sharper than a memorial. What if the partisan war had been organized earlier? Not in the way people say it casually, like a wish. I mean practically. What if the first scattered groups in the summer of 1941 had been met with radios, trained demolition men, clear chains of command, and reliable supply corridors? What if Moscow, instead of rebuilding its shattered fronts while the rear burned, had found a way, in those first months, to turn every forest into a disciplined instrument, and every rail line behind German armies into a continuing wound? Would Moscow have been threatened as it was in the autumn? Would the siege lines around Leningrad have tightened as brutally? Would the German logistics that fed their momentum have cracked sooner? Not in 1943 when sabotage reached its peak, but in 1941 when the outcome still hung on speed. That question is not fantasy. It is a best-case scenario pinned to real constraints. Radios existed. Explosives existed. Experienced underground men existed from earlier conflicts and from security services. The problem was time shock and the brutal fact that, in 1941, the Soviet state was fighting for breath. In those weeks, even the most competent institutions behaved like a man trying to swim while someone holds his head under. So let us do this properly. Let us ground ourselves in what happened, and then, with discipline, trace the branches of what might have happened if a few decisions had been made sooner and a few systems had worked better. The German advance relied on speed and rails, not poetry, rails. The roads of the West were not built for that kind of traffic, not for endless columns of trucks and guns and fuel. The railways were the arteries. The Germans repaired track, changed gauges, pressed local labor. They fought battles at the front, and behind the front they fought time. Every day a train arrived, the front line could keep moving. Every day it did not. The front line slowed, then stalled, then began to bleed. That is where the partisans mattered, even when nobody outside the trees knew their names. In the first summer, the early partisan groups were small, often no more than a platoon of men with whatever weapons they carried, when the front collapsed around them. Some were organized by local party officials, some by security organs, some by Red Army stragglers who simply gathered others and chose a direction away from German patrols. A few were prepared in advance, with caches and contacts. Most were not. They lived on what they could take, what villagers could spare, what they could steal from German depots in a lucky raid. That made them dangerous and also, sometimes, unwelcome. When a unit is starving, discipline becomes a fragile thing. You cannot romanticize it. There were commanders who kept strict order, punished theft, protected civilians as best they could. There were others who used the forest as an excuse to become bandits with slogans. The movement's reputation depended on this difference, and the Germans understood it. They did not merely hunt partisans with bullets. They tried to sever them from the people with fear. I want you to picture a map of Belarus, for instance. On paper it is lines and names. In reality it is forests, bogs, rivers, and villages spaced like islands. It was ideal terrain for concealment and movement if you knew it, and lethal if you did not. In that landscape, the partisan war grew into something the Germans could never fully control. Not because the Germans lacked force. Because they could not be everywhere, and every road and rail line was a vulnerability. By 1942, the movement began to shift from survival to strategy. That did not happen by magic. It happened because the Soviet state, battered but no longer blind, began to build a structure to support and direct the forest war. Central headquarters for the partisan movement would eventually exist, with men tasked to coordinate sabotage communications and supply. Airdrops increased. Radios became more common. Trained specialists were sent in. The partisans began to receive demolition materials designed for rail work. Not just whatever could be improvised from captured stores. And now, here is your first best-case scenario to test. What if that structure had been built in July and August of 1941 rather than later? If you take the historian's cold eye, you see the obstacles at once. The front was collapsing. Airfields were overrun. Communications were shattered. The Soviet state was evacuating industry, moving millions east, trying to rebuild command. But you also see the opportunity. The Germans were stretched. Their rear areas were not yet hardened. Their occupation systems were still forming. Their security forces were not yet fully adapted to partisan warfare. In 1941, a saboteur with a good radio could do disproportionate damage because the enemy's rear was soft. In a best-case scenario, imagine small, well-trained teams inserted behind the German spearheads, not large units needing to be fed, but compact groups focused on a single mission: cut the rail line, break the bridge, damage the signaling, then vanish. Imagine those teams linked by radio to a headquarters that could identify the most critical junctions and coordinate strikes across a region, forcing repairs to overlap, forcing guards to spread thin, forcing German trains to slow and bunch. The immediate consequence would not be some sudden collapse. War rarely offers miracles. The consequence would be friction. Delays. A constant drag on the German timetable. And on the Eastern Front, timetable was life. Now, look at the autumn of 1941, the approach to Moscow. German units were tired, their vehicles worn, their supply lines long. In our real history, the Red Army bought time with blood, and winter took its own toll. In a best-case partisan scenario, the winter would still come, the battles would still be hard, but German logistics might have reached the breaking point earlier. A rail line that delivers 50 trains a day is an artery. Reduce it to 20, then 10, and the front begins to starve. Fuel becomes rationed. Ammunition arrives late. Spare parts do not arrive at all. You could see the effect not as a grand announcement, but as 1,000 small failures, a tank platoon left behind for lack of fuel, a battery with fewer shells, a hospital without bandages, a regiment ordered to halt and wait while repairs are made far behind them. Those small failures, accumulated, change the shape of an offensive. The second best-case scenario concerns not sabotage, but intelligence. Partisans were not only demolition men. They were eyes. They watched troop movements. They counted trains. They listened to local talk. They learned the schedules of patrols. They mapped the changing face of occupation, which village was collaborating, which was resisting, where garrisons were thin, where new units arrived. In many cases, they fed this intelligence back by radio. Intelligence is rarely glamorous, but it is the difference between walking into an ambush and avoiding it. What if in 1941 and early 1942, the partisan movement had been equipped with more radios and trained operators, not merely a handful per region, but enough to create an unbroken chain of reporting? Then the Red Army's picture of the enemy rear could have sharpened sooner. The Soviets would have known faster where German reserves were moving. where rail bottlenecks formed, where fuel depots were established. This matters because the Eastern Front was not only a clash of armies, it was a contest of adaptation. The side that learned faster gained an advantage. Again, be disciplined. Radios were scarce. Operators needed training. Batteries died. Signals could be intercepted. There were security risks. But in the best-case scenario, those problems are managed earlier. The partisan war becomes not just chaotic resistance, but an integrated arm of the broader front. Now, the third best-case scenario is the one people love to talk about because it sounds dramatic. A coordinated campaign against the railways on a massive scale. In the real course of the war, by 1943, the partisans in occupied territories, particularly in Belarus and parts of Ukraine and Russia, launched large-scale sabotage actions aimed at rail lines. Bridges were blown, track was damaged repeatedly, rolling stock was attacked. The Germans were forced to deploy large security forces, repair crews' armored trains, and to harden their rear in ways that pulled resources away from the front. Those operations did not win the war alone, but they helped the Red Army's offensives by making German resupply and movement harder. What if that kind of coordinated rail campaign had been possible in 1942, before Stalingrad's outcome hardened German strategic decisions? In the best case, imagine this: as the German summer offensive of 1942 pushes toward the Volga and the Caucasus, the rear rail network feeding that offensive becomes a battlefield. Not with tanks, but with repeated cuts, synchronized across junctions and bridges. The Germans repair one section, and another fails. Trains are delayed, forced to travel in convoys, forced to wait for armored escorts. The rhythm of resupply becomes uneven. German units at the front feel it first as inconvenience, then as scarcity. The offensive, which in reality already strained German logistics, becomes even more fragile. Could that have shortened the campaign? Could it have reduced German capacity to sustain fighting in the south? Possibly. Not guaranteed. But plausible enough to matter. Now you might be tempted to say, if this is so important, why was it not done earlier? Because the partisan war was not simply a matter of courage. It was a matter of systems. You need explosives. You need people trained to use them without killing themselves. You need reliable contacts. You need discipline and secrecy. You need a supply chain that can survive winter and German sweeps. You need medical support. You need political organization to prevent units from fracturing into gangs. And you need, above all, a population willing to endure the consequences of helping. This is the part where the story becomes uncomfortable, and it must, because the Eastern Front was uncomfortable. German anti-partisan operations were not polite security measures. They were designed to terrify. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were punished. Civilians were forced into labor, deported, starved. This created a vicious cycle. The more partisans struck, the more reprisals followed. The more reprisals followed, the more people either resisted or collaborated out of fear. The Forest War was a war inside a war. Soviet partisan leadership, in many regions, tried to enforce discipline and maintain relations with civilians. They issued orders against looting. They built local councils, organized procurement, sometimes paid with vouchers or promised future compensation. They also carried out harsh measures against collaborators. The occupation produced a murky world where survival and betrayal often sat in the same house. If you want a clean moral diagram, look elsewhere. In the forests, the lines moved constantly. Now let me take you into a single night, not a specific night with a calendar date pinned to it, but a composite night built from dozens of reports and testimonies. This is how the partisan war often felt. A small group moves through wet grass. The men carry wire cutters, a few charges wrapped against moisture, and rifles that are as much comfort as use. They do not speak unless they must. The leader knows the schedule because a village boy, watched the trains and counted them, because a woman who cleans at the station heard a guard complain about the late arrival of a fuel convoy, because someone in the occupation office let a document be seen for a moment too long. This is the partisan network at work, ordinary people supplying fragments that become a plan. The group reaches the rail line. They do not attack the train itself, not tonight. The train is guarded and firing attracts pursuit. Instead, they attack the line. A few minutes of work and the charge is placed where it will do the most. Then they pull back into the dark and wait. The explosion is not a spectacle. It is a blunt sound swallowed by the forest. A section of rail is broken, twisted. The next train cannot pass. The Germans will repair it, yes. But they must do so under threat. They must bring engineers. They must guard them. They must slow traffic. And while they repair, another group somewhere else is already moving. This is how an empire bleeds without seeing the blade. Now, as a storyteller of this era, I am expected to give you names. Names are the hooks memory hangs from, and there were leaders whose names became signals. In Ukraine, Sidor Kovpak and his people conducted deep raids, moving far behind German lines, striking depots and communications, slipping away before large forces could pin them. In Belarus, the movement grew into large formations and even zones where Soviet authority, in practice, reappeared in occupied territory. In Russia's forests near Bryansk and Smolensk, partisans operated in terrain that allowed concealment and sudden strikes. There were units tied to security services conducting special tasks, intelligence, assassinations of key occupation figures, the organization of underground cells in towns. But do not make the mistake of thinking the war was carried by famous names alone. For every commander remembered, there were hundreds of local leaders you will never hear of, a former sergeant who could keep men together, a teacher who could organize a village network, a railway worker who knew which bolt to remove to cause maximum delay, a young woman who carried messages and weapons under her coat past checkpoints, because the enemy did not think to search her carefully. If you want the hidden heroes, start there. Not at the top, but at the seam where ordinary life becomes resistance. Now, let us sharpen the what if lens again, because your script wants to capture imagination, not merely recount. Here is a best-case scenario that is less about tactics and more about politics and human management inside the movement. What if the partisan movement, from the start, had been better at integrating the full range of people trapped behind the lines, particularly those who had no safe village to return to? I speak carefully here because this is where history becomes both tragic and complicated. In occupied territory, Jews were targeted for annihilation. Escaped prisoners faced recapture or death. Refugees moved without shelter. Some partisan units welcomed them, armed them, incorporated them. Others refused, either from prejudice, fear of infiltration, or simple lack of food. Some groups formed their own family camps, focused on survival as much as sabotage. The best-case scenario is not sentimental. It is operationally relevant. Every person saved and integrated could also become a fighter, a scout, a courier, a source of local intelligence. A movement that builds trust and inclusion becomes stronger. But inclusion requires food, discipline, and a moral choice. Those are not easy in winter forests. Still, imagine a best case where early Soviet planning includes systematic support for civilian camps tied to partisan brigades, with clear divisions of labor, procurement systems that avoid predation, and mechanisms to reduce internal abuses. The movement becomes not only a weapon, but a refuge. That changes the tone of occupied regions. It makes collaboration less attractive and resistance more sustainable. Now, in reality, there were examples of this, and there were failures. That is why it is a meaningful what if. It asks not for miracles, but for earlier competence and fewer self-inflicted wounds. The Germans, of course, did not stand still. They adapted. They created dedicated security units, used local auxiliaries, built fortified garrisons, ran sweeps, tried to infiltrate. They hardened rail protection with blockhouses and patrols, used armored trains, mined approaches, and punished suspected supporters. The partisan war was a contest of learning. And here is where your story can grip an audience, because it reveals something that is easy to miss if you only watch the front-line battles. The Eastern Front was not a straight clash of armies. It was a layered struggle. At the front, tanks and infantry fought for villages and river crossings. Behind the front, the Germans fought to hold their supply lines together. Behind that, the partisans fought to tear those lines apart. And behind the partisans, civilians fought to survive while deciding every day whether to risk helping, whether to keep silent, whether to betray. When you understand that, you understand why the partisan movement mattered even when it did not liberate territory in the conventional sense. It forced the occupier to fight on multiple levels at once. It made occupation expensive. It turned rail travel into anxiety. It forced German commanders to divert troops. It created uncertainty in a war where certainty was the only comfort. Now let us return to the year 1942, because this is where the movement's character begins to change. In 1941, many groups were fugitives. In 1942, many became units with identity and purpose. They established forest bases, primitive but functional. They built dugouts, field kitchens, small workshops for repairing weapons. They organized medical points. They trained recruits. They formed intelligence sections. They began to coordinate with each other. Coordination is the key word. It is the difference between a mosquito bite and a fever. In a coordinated movement, one unit hits a rail junction while another hits a bridge, and a third spreads rumors and disrupts collaboration networks. The enemy cannot respond to all at once. Repairs are delayed. Patrols are stretched. Morale suffers. Occupation officials become nervous. Local collaborators begin to doubt the permanence of German power. In war, belief is a weapon. Partisans attacked belief as much as they attacked steel. The best-case scenarios I have described depend on one thing above all: earlier coordination. So, let me put it in the blunt language of a mentor, not the polite language of commemorations. If the partisan movement is treated as a romantic afterthought, it becomes scattered heroism that bleeds away. If it is treated as a strategic arm, it becomes a force multiplier that changes the enemy's cost calculations. That is the core insight your audience needs to carry away. Now, how do we keep them watching? We do not drown them in statistics. We show them the choices. Consider a young railway worker in occupied territory. He has a job because the Germans need trains running. He also has access. He can delay a repair by misplacing a tool. He can report schedules to an underground contact. He can loosen a bolt. He can smuggle a small package from one station to another. But every action risks not only his life, but the lives of his family and neighbors. Resistance is not a poster. It is a calculus performed under pressure. Consider a village elder. German officers demand grain. Partisans demand grain. Winter is coming. Children are hungry. If he helps the partisans, the Germans may punish the village. If he refuses, the partisans may brand him a collaborator. His choices are all bad. The hidden heroism here is not always in dramatic acts. Sometimes it is in keeping a community alive while living between two forces. Consider a partisan commander with 30 men. He can raid a depot and feed his unit for a week, but it risks exposing his base. He can execute a suspected informer and ensure security, but he might kill an innocent and poison trust. He can enforce discipline harshly and keep order, or he can be lenient and watch his unit collapse into theft. The forest is not a place where leadership is optional. Every day is a test of command. These are the human gears behind the sabotage statistics. And now, I will bring us to the edge of the next turn in the story, because by late 1942, something happens that changes the scale. The movement begins to receive more systematic support, more trained personnel, and more ambitious tasks. Deep raids expand, coordinated strikes become more frequent, and the Germans, increasingly aware that their rear is not secure, begin to treat whole regions as hostile territory rather than occupied land. The war in the trees grows into a war of systems. In the months ahead, you will see operations that are not merely acts of survival, but deliberate campaigns aimed at crippling transport, communications, and morale in support of major offensives at the front. You will see how partisan zones formed in some areas, how underground networks in towns fed intelligence to forest units, how supply by air reshaped what was possible, and how the Germans responded with sweeps that sought to erase the movement at its roots. And you will see the question sharpen again. Not, what if partisans existed? Because they did. But what if, at the decisive moments, they had been used with maximum effect? What if the best case had been achieved not by legend, but by logistics, discipline, and coordination? Hold that question, because when the next phase begins, the forests will no longer be a refuge for scattered men. They will become an instrument, and the enemy will finally understand that the Eastern Front has a second battlefield he cannot fully occupy. The question I left you with is the same one that haunted officers in warm rooms and men in wet boots. What if the best case had been achieved, not by legend, but by logistics, discipline, and coordination? Now let me tighten it into a hook you can feel in your chest. What if, on one single night in 1942, the right junction went dark and stayed dark for 72 hours? Not a bridge in the middle of nowhere. Not a stretch of track that could be bypassed. I mean the kind of junction where lines converge like veins, where locomotives queue, where wagons are sorted, where fuel and ammunition pause before moving forward. A place the front depends on, but the rear assumes will keep functioning because it always has. If you want to understand why the partisan war mattered, stop thinking in heroic portraits and start thinking in delays. A delay is what turns a plan into a scramble. A scramble is what turns a confident army into a nervous one, and a nervous army makes mistakes. By late 1942, the Forest War began to change shape. The scattered groups who survived the first year, who learned which villages could be trusted and which trails did not show footprints in early snow, were no longer only fugitives. They were becoming an instrument. That shift did not come from courage alone. Courage was abundant from the beginning. What changed was the connective tissue: radios, couriers, supply drops, trained specialists, and a clearer relationship between the underground in towns and the armed detachments outside them. When that connective tissue holds, sabotage stops being random. It becomes an argument aimed at the enemy's throat. You can see the German side of it in their own behavior. They began hardening their rear, reorganizing security, building garrisons, increasing patrols along rail lines, and forcing local auxiliaries into the dirtiest work. Their fear was not poetic, it was practical. They understood that the Eastern Front was eating trains faster than their factories could replace them, and that every locomotive delayed behind the lines made the front line weaker. This is the moment where I ask you to stay with me, because the best-case scenarios you want are not fantasy castles. They are forked roads inside real constraints. So I will give you several forked roads, each one anchored in what the partisans actually did, and each one pushed one step further into what could have happened if key frictions had been reduced. First fork the radio network. By 1942 and into 1943, more partisan units carried radios, and more of those radios could actually reach headquarters reliably. That sounds simple. It is not. Batteries fail, operators get captured, codes get compromised. Weather kills transmissions. A radio is not just a device, It is a fragile relationship between a unit and the larger war. Now imagine the best case. Imagine that in late 1941, the Soviet apparatus had prioritized radio training and distribution for partisan warfare the way it prioritized rifles for infantry. Not in total numbers that were impossible, but enough to create redundancy. Enough that, when one operator was lost, the network did not go blind. In that best case, three things become possible earlier. 1. Intelligence becomes faster and more actionable. Instead of vague reports arriving weeks late through couriers, you get near-daily updates on rail traffic, new garrisons, depots, German sweeps, and the movement of reserves. 2. Sabotage becomes synchronized. A single rail break is repaired quickly. 10 breaks across 5 districts, coordinated within the same window, force the enemy into a repair crisis. You do not need to destroy everything. You need to overload the enemy's ability to fix. 3. Partisan units stop living as isolated islands. They can be warned about sweeps. They can be diverted. They can be reinforced. They can be told to lie low when necessary and strike when the timing matters most. The reality was messier. The best case is cleaner. And the question for you, as a storyteller testing a scenario, is whether that cleanliness was plausible. It was plausible in pieces. Not everywhere at once. Not in 1941 summer chaos. But in key regions with favorable terrain and strong local support, a denser radio network could have formed earlier, and if it had, German rear security would have faced a more coordinated opponent sooner. Second fork, rail war earlier in our real history. Large-scale coordinated attacks against rail lines expanded as the partisan movement matured, especially as major Soviet offensives approached. By the time the Red Army moved from defense to sustained strategic offensives, partisan sabotage behind the lines became a planned complement. The railways were treated as targets with priority. Now imagine the best case. What if, in early 1942, as the Germans prepared for their summer drive to the south, a coordinated railway campaign had already been operating at scale in the central and northern sectors? I want you to picture German planners trying to concentrate fuel and ammunition for a major offensive. They count trains. They schedule deliveries. They build a timetable that assumes the rear will do its job. Then, across a broad belt, rail lines begin failing repeatedly, not in one place, but in the exact places that force traffic to detour, bottleneck, and wait. A bridge is cut near a junction. A switch yard is sabotaged. Signaling is disrupted. A repair train hits a mine section. The enemy brings guards. The partisans shift to another segment. The enemy brings more guards. Now the guards themselves are spread thin and vulnerable. The front does not collapse overnight, but the tempo slows. Tempo is the invisible currency of this war. When the Germans had tempo, they could choose battles. When they lost it, they began reacting. The best case outcome is not magic, it is reduced German operational reach. It is fewer options at the front because the rear cannot deliver the necessary volume reliably. If you are thinking like a strategist, you realize that slowing an offensive by even a few days can change where it stalls. It can change which river line becomes a defensive anchor. It can change whether a city can be surrounded. The Eastern Front often turned on timing as much as force. Third fork, deep raids with better sustainment. Some partisan commanders led long raids far behind German lines, striking depots, communications, and administrative nodes, then disappearing into forests and marshes before large forces could pin them. These raids were not just military actions. They were psychological. They told villagers and collaborators that German control was not absolute, and they told German officers that the rear was a battlefield. But deep raids require sustainment. Food, medical support, guides, reliable intelligence. Without those, deep raids become suicide marches or bandit expeditions that poison local support. Now imagine the best case. What if deep raid doctrine had been standardized earlier and supported with more systematic supply drops, not to create enormous permanent bases, but to keep raiding units light, mobile, and fed without stripping villages. In that best case, raiding units become less dependent on forced requisitioning. That matters because forced requisitioning can turn a population against you, and in partisan war, the population is oxygen. With better sustainment, deep raids could be conducted more frequently and with clearer operational objectives, not just survival raids. They could target specific logistical nodes timed to major battles at the front, creating a layered pressure that the Germans would struggle to absorb. Fourth fork. The underground in towns, unified with the forest, people imagine partisans as only forest fighters. That is incomplete. Behind every successful partisan region, there was usually an underground web in towns and villages, railway workers, clerks, translators, policemen who secretly fed information, women who carried messages, youths who watched patrol patterns, people who hid weapons, people who forged documents, people who warned of sweeps. The problem was trust. The Germans built a world where betrayal was rewarded and fear was constant. Underground networks could be infiltrated. A single compromised contact could unravel a chain. Now imagine the best case. What if, from 1941 onward, the Soviet side had invested more heavily in secure underground tradecraft for local networks, especially in key rail towns and administrative centers? Tradecraft sounds like a cold word, but it is the difference between life and death. It means compartmentalization, so no one person knows too much. It means code phrases. It means safe houses. It means disciplined communication and clear boundaries between cells. It means training. In the best case, the underground becomes more resilient. More sabotage happens inside yards and offices, not just on tracks. More documents are stolen. More schedules are copied. More collaborators are identified. More German plans are predicted. Now I will give you the sharpest what if of this entire subject, because it is the one that touches the heart of German power in the East. What if the partisan movement had made the occupation itself unworkable sooner? Occupation is not only soldiers. Occupation is paperwork, food collection, labor drafts, local administration, railway management, policing, translation. Every one of those functions relies on locals to some degree. Without local compliance, occupation becomes an exhausting grind, and the occupier must spend more resources for less output. In the best case, a stronger and earlier partisan underground would have increased the cost of administration sooner. More officials would have required protection. More offices would have been disrupted. More labor drafts would have failed. The Germans would have had to divert more troops to rear security earlier, reducing combat strength at the front. This is the hidden lever. It is not as dramatic as blowing a bridge, but it is just as important. Now let me bring you back to the human reality, because a script that lives only in abstractions will lose people. The Forest War was lived in small experiences. A messenger moves at dusk, not because dusk is romantic, but because dusk is uncertain. A child runs a note in a loaf of bread. A woman carries medicine in a basket that looks ordinary. A railway worker pretends his hands are clumsy while he loosens a fitting. A partisan lies in a wet ditch for hours while a German patrol passes close enough to hear boots shifting. This war was made of patience, and it was made of fear. German sweeps were the nightmare that hung over everything. When the Germans decided a forest region was too dangerous, they did not simply send a patrol. They sent a machine troops, auxiliaries, dogs, informers, and a cold determination to clear, punish, and terrorize. The partisans responded with movement and concealment. They broke into smaller groups. They changed camps. They used decoys. They hid supplies in caches. They fought when they had to, and ran when fighting would lead to encirclement. In those moments, the best-case scenario is not a heroic stand. It is a clean escape. It is the radio message that warns a unit to move 2 nights before the cordon closes. It is the hidden path through a bog that a local guide knows. It is the ability to evacuate non-combatants tied to the unit so they are not caught in the sweep. This is the second hard truth in partisan war. Victory often looks like not being destroyed. Now, you want an engaging structure, and you want it to feel like I am talking directly to you, not lecturing. So let me speak plainly. If you could travel back into that war with only one advantage to give the partisans, what would you choose? More rifles. They captured rifles. More men? Men were abundant. More courage. Courage was never the shortage. The shortage was coordination, supply, and communication. That is why our forked roads keep returning to radios, training, and logistics. Now let us move forward in time because the war itself moved forward. By 1943, the Eastern Front began tilting decisively. The Red Army, having absorbed and learned, began launching offensives that did not just survive, but pushed. On the German side, the rear became more anxious because each Soviet advance threatened to reconnect partisan zones with the front, turning isolated guerrilla warfare into something closer to a collapsing rear. This is where the partisan movement became, in certain regions, a genuine strategic factor rather than an irritant. A strategic factor does 3 things. It forces the enemy to allocate significant forces away from the main front. It reduces the efficiency of supply and movement. It undermines the reliability of occupation. In 1943, those effects were visible. German units guarding railways were not fighting at the front. Repair crews worked under threat, slowing traffic. Local administrators lived in fear, demanding more protection. The occupier became heavier, more brutal, more paranoid. And brutality, while it can terrorize, also produces resistance if the population believes the occupier cannot protect them forever. Now, here is a best-case scenario that most people overlook because it is less explosive, but more decisive. What if the partisans had been able to consistently keep key rail segments down not for hours, but for days at a time across multiple regions, timed to major front operations? A rail line can be repaired quickly if it is cut once. If it is cut again the next night, and again the next, the repair effort becomes a treadmill. The Germans then face a choice. They can concentrate guards on the rail line, which leaves other areas open, or they can spread guards, which makes each section vulnerable. Or they can divert rail traffic to alternate routes, which creates bottlenecks elsewhere. In every case, the system becomes less efficient. In the best case, the partisan campaign is not sporadic. It is sustained and prioritized according to German logistical vulnerability. And here is how that could have translated into front-line consequences. German reinforcements arrive late. German artillery receives fewer shells. German fuel deliveries become erratic. German units cannot redeploy quickly to seal breakthroughs. German commanders become cautious, hoarding supplies, shortening offensives. None of these effects creates a cinematic explosion. Together, they change the geometry of war. Now, your audience will ask, even if they do not say it, whether partisans could really control outcomes like this. So, I will be rigorous. Partisans were not a substitute for armies. They could not capture major cities alone. They could not hold open terrain against mechanized forces. Their power depended on terrain, local support, and the enemy's overextension. But in the Eastern Theater, the enemy was overextended by nature. Distances were vast. Rail lines were long. Occupied regions were large. The Germans had to secure too much with too little. That is why partisan warfare is not a footnote in the East. It is a structural feature. Now, let me bring in another uncomfortable truth, because if we avoid it, this becomes propaganda rather than history. The partisan movement contained multiple loyalties and multiple methods. Some units were closely tied to Soviet state organs and operated with strict political objectives. Others were more local and pragmatic. Tension existed between military effectiveness and political control. There were cases of harsh internal discipline. There were cases of conflict between units. There were cases where the line between requisition and theft blurred. There were cases where civilians suffered from both sides. In our best-case scenario, those frictions are reduced. How? By earlier standardization of discipline and procurement rules. By better supply so units do not prey on villages. By clearer command structures so units coordinate rather than compete. By consistent punishment of abuses to maintain legitimacy. This is not sentimental. It is practical. A partisan movement that loses legitimacy loses its oxygen. In the long run, the best-case outcome depends on trust. Now, let me turn your what-if lens into a set of vivid alternate pathways that you can present as a sequence for viewers to debate. Scenario 1. The early rail choke point campaign. Premise: in late 1941, a specialized sabotage doctrine is distributed to select regions with heavy rail importance. Small teams are trained specifically to target rails, switches, and signaling using methods that maximize repair time. Consequence: German rear security forces are forced into a more defensive posture earlier. Transport slows. Front operations lose tempo. The German push toward key objectives faces increased supply friction. The debate question: would that friction have been enough to alter the timing and depth of German offensives? Or would German adaptation have neutralized it by early 1942? Scenario 2. The radio net that never goes blind. Premise: a dense radio and courier network is built in key partisan zones, creating redundancy and consistent intelligence flow. Consequence: partisans avoid major sweeps more effectively, survive at higher rates, and coordinate strikes more precisely. The Red Army receives more accurate rear intelligence. The debate question: does earlier and more reliable intelligence materially improve Red Army operational planning, or does the chaos of 1941 and 1942 limit the ability to act on that information? Scenario 3. The occupation administration crisis. Premise: underground cells in towns and rail hubs receive better training and are more effectively linked to forest units. Sabotage shifts from tracks alone to yard operations, labor drafts, and administrative disruption. Consequence: occupation becomes more costly and less productive sooner. German resources shift further toward rear security. Local collaboration becomes more fragile. The debate question: could this have forced German commanders to shorten their operational ambitions, or would they simply intensify repression and still extract what they needed? Scenario 4. The humanitarian integration advantage. Premise: partisan brigades develop more consistent practices for incorporating refugees, escaped prisoners, and targeted populations as fighters and support staff, while maintaining discipline and supply. Consequence: partisan manpower increases and local support improves in certain regions. The movement gains resilience and legitimacy. The debate question: would this strengthen the movement without compromising secrecy and mobility, or would the logistical burden and infiltration risk outweigh the benefits? These are not fantasies. They are disciplined extrapolations. Now, I want to bring you to a moment where the Forest War and the Front War begin to touch, because this is where your narrative gains momentum. When the Red Army advances, it does not enter empty land. It enters a landscape shaped by occupation and resistance. In some areas, partisans can act as guides, scouts, and a stabilizing presence for liberated zones, identifying collaborators, locating mines, pointing out hidden depots. In other areas, they are exhausted, depleted, and suspicious, hardened by years of fighting without formal support. The best-case scenario here is that partisan units are integrated cleanly into the advancing apparatus, with clear rules, coordination, and a plan to transition from guerrilla warfare to stabilization. If done well, that transition prevents chaos. It speeds rebuilding. It preserves intelligence networks. It reduces the vacuum that often follows retreating occupiers. If done poorly, it creates friction, mistrust, and power struggles. I am not going to pretend this was always done well. War is not tidy. But you can see why it matters. The partisan war was not only about destroying trains, it was also about shaping what came after. Now, before I move toward the next crest of this story, I want to leave you with one more hook, because your audience needs a reason to keep listening. If you could choose one single target category to maximize partisan impact, what would it be? Rails are obvious. Bridges are dramatic. But the real vulnerability might be repair capacity. In other words, do not merely break the rail. Break the enemy's ability to fix the rail quickly. Target the tools. Target the repair crews when possible. Target the depots of replacement rails and spikes and signaling equipment. Target the points where repair trains are stored. Target the administrative timetable that organizes repairs. In the best-case scenario, the partisan campaign evolves into a campaign against repair systems, not just infrastructure. That is a mature guerrilla strategy, and it is exactly the kind of strategic evolution you begin to see as the movement grows more capable. We have now reached the threshold of the period where partisan operations in some regions begin to take on the character of campaigns rather than scattered strikes, where coordination becomes more deliberate, where the Germans respond with larger and more systematic countermeasures, and where the forest war becomes something that can be timed to the turning of the larger front. The next phase will bring you into that escalation. You will see how sabotage expands from opportunistic breaks to planned regional disruption. You will see how German rear security hardens and how partisans adapt again. You will see how the moral and political pressures inside occupied societies sharpen, how collaboration and resistance collide more violently, and how the hidden war begins to influence not just supply, but the confidence of an occupying army that can no longer pretend the rear is safe. And when we arrive there, the question will no longer be only, what if they had been organized earlier? It will become even sharper. What if the partisans, at the decisive moments, had been coordinated so well that they could temporarily paralyze the enemy's rear in the exact week it mattered most? That is where this story is heading, because that is where the Eastern Front reveals the partisans could do it, not as scattered lightning, but as a controlled storm. What if, for one decisive week, the German rear stopped behaving like a machine and started behaving like a wounded animal, jerking, confused, unable to feed its own front? That is the hinge we have reached. Because by this stage of the war, the forests were no longer merely hiding places. They had become a second staff, a second hand, reaching into the enemy's pockets and pulling out his time, his fuel, his confidence. I want you to picture the German rear the way it actually was, not the way it appears on neat operational maps. It was a moving city of necessity. It was rail yards choking with wagons. It was repair crews living under pressure. It was warehouses, fuel dumps, workshops, field hospitals, headquarters, police detachments, auxiliary formations, and local administration trying to squeeze resources out of occupied land while also keeping that land quiet. And what the partisans learned, sometimes by instinct before doctrine ever caught up, was that you do not need to defeat that moving city in a set battle. You only need to make it unreliable. Reliability is the secret strength of any modern army. When reliability collapses, even strong units at the front begin to behave like frightened men. Now, I have to be honest with you about why this next phase matters so much. In the early months, partisan activity could be described as persistence. By the middle years, it becomes pressure. But here, as the war turns and the Red Army begins to regain strategic initiative, partisan warfare becomes timing. Timing is everything. If you strike the rail lines in winter, you slow trains and freeze repair crews, but the enemy may not be planning a major offensive. If you strike in a week when the enemy is shifting reserves, concentrating armor, moving fuel and ammunition for a decisive battle, then every delay becomes amplified. A jam in a rail yard becomes a shortage at the front. A broken switch becomes a delayed division. A slow repair becomes an opening that the front cannot close. That is why the question is no longer simply, can the partisans harass the enemy? The question becomes, can the partisans shape a decisive moment? So let us step into one such moment. The Germans, after their setbacks, begin planning for a major effort to regain the initiative. They need to move forces, build stocks, and concentrate strength. That concentration is not performed by speeches. It is performed by transport. This is where the best-case scenario becomes very sharp. What if the partisans had been able to hit not just track, but the enemy's concentration process itself? Not just cutting rails, but forcing the Germans to move in a way that is slower, noisier, more guarded, more cautious. Because concentration is a vulnerable act. When an army concentrates, it becomes predictable. Predictability is what saboteurs live on. Now I can hear the skeptical voice already, the one that says, surely the Germans would just guard the rails. They did. But you must understand the scale. Guarding every kilometer is impossible. Guarding every junction, every bridge, every repair dump, every signaling point, every station is a fantasy. When the rear is huge, security becomes a game of odds. The partisans tried to make those odds ugly. In this phase, the most effective partisan thinking is not about spectacular destruction. It is about systemic interruption. Break the line. Force the repair. Strike the repair system. Repeat. And if you can repeat across multiple regions at once, you do not just cause damage. You create an atmosphere in which the rear becomes nervous, and nervous rears make mistakes. Now, here is the first what if fork to put on the table for your viewers, and I want it framed as something they can argue about. What if the partisans had been given one priority above all others to disrupt the movement of German reserves? Not fuel, not food, not administration. Reserves. Because reserves are what a commander uses to seal a breakthrough, to restore a line, to turn a local problem into a stable defense. If reserves arrive late, a small breach becomes a large one. In a best-case scenario, partisan headquarters identifies the key rail arteries used to shift reserves in a given season and concentrates sabotage there. Not randomly, not anywhere a rail exists, but at bottlenecks where detours are limited. Junctions, bridges, yards. Then, instead of breaking rails in 10 unconnected places, they break rails in 5 places that matter more, and they do it repeatedly. The enemy begins to reroute trains, which creates new bottlenecks, which are then attacked. This is not brute force. It is chess played in mud. Would that have changed outcomes? In some cases, yes. Not because trains are romantic, but because the front is hungry and fear travels faster than supplies. Now, let me bring you closer, because this cannot remain only in strategic language. In the forests, men and women lived by an internal calendar that did not match the calendar on a wall. Their calendar was made of cues. The first thaw that turned paths into traps. The first hard freeze that made roads usable. The first appearance of German sweep units moving in patterns. The sudden increase in rail traffic that meant something was coming. The rumor from a station clerk that a large shipment of fuel had arrived. The nervous behavior of occupation police who sensed an operation. Partisan intelligence was often mundane, but it was rarely useless. If you know what to look for, mundane details become warnings. Now, imagine a best case where that intelligence is harvested more professionally. Instead of a single operator writing a report and hoping it reaches someone, you have a routine system. Information is categorized. Traffic counts are tracked. Patterns are compared across districts. A headquarters can see that rail movement is increasing towards certain sectors. That headquarters can then order sabotage not where it is convenient, but where it is most likely to disrupt something that is about to happen. This is what mature warfare looks like, even in the woods. Now, let us talk about German countermeasures, because your audience needs to feel the tension rising. The Germans did not sit in their rear and accept sabotage like bad weather. They adapted. They used armored trains. They increased guards at key points. They forced local auxiliaries into patrol work. They launched sweeps into forest regions. They tried to infiltrate. They tried to cut the partisans off from civilians. They tried to make the cost of helping too high. In some regions, they also tried a quieter approach: persuasion, intimidation, rewards for information. A man who informs might be paid. A village might be spared. A family might be protected. And that offer, in a landscape of fear, is a weapon. So, here is the second fork. What if the partisans had improved counterintelligence earlier? This is the unpleasant side of partisan warfare. An infiltrator can destroy a unit without firing a shot. A compromised courier route can lead a sweep directly into a base. A single captured radio can unravel a network. In the best case, you build compartmentalization from the start. You limit who knows what. You keep cells small. You rotate codes frequently. You train people to recognize patterns of deception. You build redundancy so the loss of one node does not collapse the system. If this had been done more consistently earlier, partisan survival rates would likely have improved in some areas, and improved survival means sustained pressure, not just bursts of activity. And sustained pressure is what makes the enemy restructure his rear, which is exactly what you want. Now, I will give you the third fork, the one that turns this from war in the trees into war inside the occupation. What if the partisans and the underground had deliberately focused on administrative paralysis? Not just sabotage on rails, but sabotage on governance. For an occupation to function, it must collect. It must register. It must draft labor. It must distribute passes. It must organize local policing. It must punish. It must reward. Each one of those functions runs through people, paper, and routine. In the best case, the underground targets routine. Clerks misfile records. Lists disappear. Orders arrive late. Draft notices are sabotaged. Labor detachments fail to assemble. Local police are quietly undermined. Supply requisitions become unreliable. The Germans can respond with more force, yes, but more force means more strain on an already stretched system. And if the front is absorbing losses, the rear cannot keep expanding forever. This is how you make the occupation feel like sinking sand. Now, to keep you with me, I will narrow down into a story element your viewers will remember because they need an image that sticks. There is a particular kind of fear that appears when a soldier realizes the rear is not safe. It is not the fear of a battlefield you can see. It is the fear of a road that looks quiet and might not be. It is the fear of a rail line that looks repaired and might fail again. It is the fear of a village that looks obedient and might be watching you. That fear changes behavior. It makes men suspicious. It makes units heavier. It slows movement. It makes commanders demand more escort. And every escort is a soldier not at the front. This is not a romantic victory. It is a victory of friction. Now, for the sake of your what-if structure, I am going to lay out a sequence of alternate narratives that stay plausible and that viewers can argue about without drifting into fantasy. Alternate narrative 1. The week of the silent junctions. Premise: a partisan headquarters identifies 3 or 4 key junctions that handle a large share of traffic, feeding a major German concentration. Instead of dispersing sabotage, they concentrate it. Multiple detachments coordinate strikes on track, switches, and signaling around those nodes. Follow-up teams strike repair capacity. The goal is not a single cut. The goal is repeated disruption. What changes? German concentration slows. Reserves arrive in waves rather than on time. Front commanders become cautious. Plans are altered. The Germans either delay or simplify operations, reducing their ability to surprise. Your discussion question: does a slowed concentration translate into a different outcome at the front, or does the enemy compensate with road movement and brute force? Alternate narrative 2. The reserve that arrives too late. Premise: a single division is delayed by repeated rail disruptions and security issues. It arrives days later than planned, or arrives missing key elements. What changes? A frontline crisis that might have been sealed becomes a breakthrough. The psychological effect is severe. Commanders begin doubting their rear. Your discussion question: how often in large wars are outcomes decided by delayed reinforcements rather than battlefield bravery? Alternate narrative 3. The occupation that collapses from inside. Premise: underground networks, trained earlier and linked more securely to forest units, cause administrative disruption in multiple towns. Labor drafts fail. Food collection becomes uneven. Collaboration becomes more dangerous. Local police units become unreliable. What changes? The occupation's ability to extract resources declines. Security requirements rise. German rear forces expand. Front combat strength shrinks. Your discussion question: is occupation collapse primarily driven by armed resistance, or by the slow erosion of routine and compliance? Alternate narrative 4. The stabilized partisan zones. Premise: certain regions evolve into persistent partisan-dominated areas with semi-organized life supply, medical points, training, and better discipline that reduces harm to civilians. These zones become stable bases rather than temporary hideouts. What changes? Sabotage becomes continuous rather than episodic. German sweeps become costly and less effective. Local support deepens. Your discussion question: does stability make partisan warfare stronger, or does it make bases easier to locate and destroy? These are not fairy tales. They are structured questions built from the way guerrilla warfare actually works. Now, let me pull the narrative forward, because we are reaching the stage where the Germans respond with larger countermeasures, and the forest war becomes harsher. A sweep is not merely a patrol. A sweep is an attempt to reset the map by force. It is the occupier trying to remove uncertainty from his rear. The sweep's logic is simple: isolate the partisans from civilians, deny them food, destroy their bases, and terrify the population into refusing support. In the forests, the response is also simple, but demanding: avoid encirclement, preserve the core, keep the network alive. This is where radios and intelligence become life itself. A warning received 2 days early is the difference between slipping away and being trapped. In the best-case scenario, partisan networks develop early warning systems like a living perimeter. Villages send signals. Couriers move quietly. Observation posts watch road movement. When a sweep begins forming, units disperse before the cordon closes. If that dispersal is done well, the sweep becomes expensive and disappointing. It consumes German time and fuel for limited results. It also exposes German units to ambush and constant harassment. The sweep becomes a punishment for the sweeper. If dispersal is done poorly, the sweep can destroy a unit, and with it a region's resistance. This is why discipline matters. A partisan unit is not a band of brave men. It is an organism that survives by rules. Now, I need to address the moral weight without drowning in it. The partisan war, like all wars, produced hard choices. Collaboration was not always ideological. Sometimes it was fear. Sometimes it was survival. Sometimes it was revenge. The partisans often punished collaborators. The Germans punished suspected supporters. Civilians were caught between. In a best-case scenario, both the discipline of partisan units and their relationship with civilians is strengthened, reducing unnecessary harm. That is not only moral, it is strategic. The more civilians trust the resistance, the more information flows, The more support exists, the more the occupier is isolated. So here is the fifth fork, and it may be the most important for a best case framing that is not childish. What if the partisan movement had achieved higher legitimacy earlier? Legitimacy is built by behavior, by discipline, by protecting civilians when possible, by punishing abuse inside one's own ranks, by distributing resources fairly, by avoiding needless predation. In the best case, legitimacy deepens support. Deep support provides food, shelter, intelligence, and recruits. That makes sabotage and survival easier. It becomes a cycle of strength. In the worst case, abuse undermines support. Civilians become fearful of both sides. Information dries up. Units become isolated. Isolation makes them desperate. Desperation produces more abuse. The cycle turns the wrong way. This is not theory. This is how insurgencies live or die. Now, as we approach the next turn, I want you to feel the scale again. The Eastern Front is enormous. The partisan war is not a single story. It is hundreds of local wars stitched together by geography and policy. In some places, forests and marshes made sustained operations possible. In other places, open terrain made concealment harder. In some regions, local support was stronger. In others, ethnic and political tensions complicated everything. In some zones, German control was tight. In others, it was thin. That variation is why broad claims are dangerous. The right way to tell this story is to keep the strategic arc while admitting the local differences. So I will keep doing what I have done from the beginning. Speak from the perspective of the witness historian, the one who has listened to enough accounts to know the pattern, and who refuses to pretend every region was identical. Now, here is the next hook, the one that carries us into the escalation that follows. What if the partisans had been able to temporarily paralyze the enemy rear at the exact moment a major Soviet offensive began? Think about what that would mean. At the front, German units are being pressed. They need ammunition and fuel. They need reserves. They need the ability to retreat in order, not in panic. They need communication. If at that same moment the rear is suffering repeated rail breaks, confused administration, delayed repairs, disrupted signals, and fear, then the front does not merely weaken. It becomes brittle. Brittle fronts break suddenly, and when brittle fronts break, the consequences cascade. Units retreat without cohesion. Depots are abandoned. Roads clog. Commanders lose clarity. The very act of retreat becomes chaotic. Now, do not let your imagination run away into melodrama. The Germans were capable, and they fought hard. They did not collapse like paper. But they did experience moments when their lines fractured and their retreat became costly. The partisans, when synchronized with the front, could push those moments toward fracture. This is the operational essence of our best-case scenario. And now I will leave you at the doorstep of the next escalation, because it is at this point that the forest war, in some regions, becomes coordinated enough to resemble a campaign with a beginning, middle, and planned end. In the next phase, the question stops being speculative and starts being measurable. Not, could the rear be paralyzed, but how close did it come, and what would have changed if it had gone further? You will see the enemy respond with heavier rear security, and you will see the partisans respond with more cunning and more system. You will see how strikes evolve from isolated breaks to sustained pressure along key arteries. You will see how local networks become the difference between survival and destruction, and you will see that the hidden war was never only a story of gunfire. It was a story of information, routine, and the fragility of the occupier's confidence. So here is the question I want you to hold, and I want you to answer it in your own mind before we go further. If you were the German commander responsible for the rear, what would frighten you more? A partisan unit that can fight a skirmish, or a partisan network that can make your entire transport system unreliable? Because one threatens a patrol, the other threatens the war. And that, in the end, is why the hidden heroes of the Eastern Front mattered. They fought in the places the enemy assumed would remain quiet. They fought in the seams of the machine. They turned certainty into doubt, and doubt into delay, and delay into weakness. If you have classmates or friends who only know the Eastern Front as tanks and trenches, tell them to look behind the lines. Ask them this simple question: if an army cannot trust its rear, can it ever truly win at the front? Hold that thought, because the answer is written not in speeches, not in medals, but in the quiet arithmetic of trains that never arrived, bridges that failed at the wrong hour, and orders that came too late to save a line. Now I want to bring you to the end of this road, where the hidden war in the trees stops being a shadow story and becomes part of the main story, whether the generals liked it or not. And I want to do it the way those years demanded, plainly, without romance, without modern flourishes, with the steady voice of a man who has spent too many nights listening for footsteps. The hook that changes the whole picture. What if, in the decisive season, the partisans had not merely slowed the machine, but made it stutter so hard that the front cracked faster and wider? Not by some mythical super strike. Not by a miracle. By doing one thing consistently and at scale, turning German logistics from mostly reliable into always uncertain. Because uncertainty is poison to an occupying army. You can fight bravery, you can fight numbers, but when your rear is unreliable, you begin fighting your own schedule, your own shortages, your own fear. You begin bleeding without seeing the wound. That is the lens for the finale. We have spoken about survival becoming pressure, pressure becoming timing. Now we talk about timing becoming collapse. First, let's get the history straight, in the way it actually felt. By the time the war reaches its later years, the partisan movement in key regions is no longer a handful of hunted men. It is networks, zones, and routines. It is radio sets crackling in dugouts, couriers moving along paths that never appear on official maps, and demolition teams who understand that one rail line is not a line on paper, but a lifeline for an army. The Germans, meanwhile, have learned too. They harden junctions, they escort trains, they fortify stations, they increase sweeps, they recruit and pressure local auxiliaries. They try to build a rear that behaves like a secured fortress. But a rear is not a fortress when it stretches hundreds of miles and rests on the labor and silence of people who do not want you there. So the rear becomes a struggle of competing systems. One system tries to extract and control. The other system tries to disrupt and survive. And every month that passes, the question becomes sharper. Can disruption be focused enough to shape the outcome of a major front operation? In the later period, in some places, the answer is yes, not always. Not everywhere. But enough to matter. You do not need to believe in legend to accept this. You only need to accept that an army cannot move, reinforce, or retreat efficiently without transport and routine. Now, with that foundation, let's walk through the best-case scenarios in a way that keeps you watching and gives you something to argue about. Brainstorming the best-case paths, without fantasy, I promised, forked roads grounded in reality. Here are the four that matter most, and they build on everything we have already covered. Scenario 1. The rear paralysis window. What if partisan leadership could reliably create a short window, 3 to 7 days, where key rail segments in a region are repeatedly down? Repairs are slowed, and traffic becomes chaotic, timed to a major Soviet push. That window is not permanent. It does not need to be. The front does not need the enemy rear destroyed forever. It needs it confused at the worst moment. Scenario 2. The reserves that never quite arrive. What if the partisans focus less on general disruption and more on the movement of German reserves, the units that patch holes, counterattack, stabilize retreats? A delayed reserve can be the difference between a contained breach and a rolling collapse. Scenario 3. The repair system as the true target. What if sabotage shifts from break track to break the ability to fix track quickly? Tools, repair trains, replacement rails, signaling equipment, the administrative routines that organize repairs. Disrupt those, and every later cut becomes more expensive. Scenario 4. The occupation administration exhaustion. What if underground cells? Better protected and more disciplined, because the occupation's paperwork machine to fail repeatedly. Not dramatic, but corrosive. Labor drafts fail. Requisitions become uneven. Local policing becomes unreliable. The occupier has to spend soldiers on governance instead of combat. Those four paths are not separate. In the best case, they reinforce each other. That is how systems collapse, not from one blow, but from multiple pressures aligned. Now, let's anchor these scenarios inside the reality of how the later Eastern Front moved. The historical context that gives these scenarios teeth, the later Eastern Front, becomes a contest of momentum. When the Red Army regains strategic initiative, the German side increasingly relies on shifting forces, building reserves, and retreating in an orderly way when it must. Orderly movement requires transport. Transport requires security. Security requires manpower. Manpower is finite, so when partisan sabotage increases, the Germans face a choice they do not want. Do you guard the rear more heavily and weaken the front? Or do you keep the front strong and accept rear vulnerability? That is the trap, and it is why the partisan war is not a side story. It is a pressure that forces the enemy into bad options. Now, let me show you what that looked like in human terms. A train does not arrive. That means fuel is late. Fuel being late means a unit cannot move. A unit that cannot move cannot counterattack. A counterattack that does not happen becomes a breakthrough. A breakthrough forces retreat. Retreat forces abandonment of depots. Abandoned depots feed the enemy or are destroyed. Destroyed depots deepen shortages. Shortages create further retreat. You can watch that chain like a river picking up speed. The partisans did not create every link in that chain, but they could strengthen the current at the moment it mattered. Now the heart of the finale, how the hidden war and the main war meet. When a major offensive begins, the front becomes hungry in a way you can almost smell. Ammunition disappears quickly. Fuel drains. Communications become frantic. Commanders ask for reserves. The rear is supposed to answer. This is when partisan timing becomes lethal. In the best-case scenario, partisan forces are not just active. They are synchronized. They attack junctions and bridges in a patterned way. They disrupt signaling so trains bunch and wait. They hit repair systems. They ambush patrols just enough to keep security nervous and slow. The objective is not annihilation. It is hesitation. A rear that hesitates becomes a rear that cannot save the front. And now, I will tell you, the grim elegance of it, a guerrilla does not need to defeat a panzer division. He only needs to make that panzer division arrive late, tired, short of fuel, and unsure of its route. That is how a forest war affects an armored war. The German response, and why it still wasn't enough. The Germans, faced with growing rear insecurity, tried to fight the trees with bureaucracy and steel. They built stronger garrisons. They increased sweeps. They used armored escorts. They demanded more from local auxiliaries. They made punishment harsher. But harshness is not always strength. Harshness can be an admission of insecurity, because every garrison is a mouth to feed. Every patrol consumes fuel. Every sweep consumes time. Every escort ties up men and weapons that could be used elsewhere. The occupier's rear becomes heavier and heavier, like a man carrying armor while trying to run. And the partisans learned to exploit that heaviness. They did not always seek direct clashes. They sought to make the enemy spend energy for little return. If the Germans concentrated security on one rail line, sabotage shifted to another. If the Germans swept one forest, the units dispersed and returned later. If the Germans infiltrated one network, other networks learned and tightened. This is a contest of adaptation, and by the later phase, the partisans in key regions had become seasoned at it. The best-case consequences stated with discipline. Let's be rigorous about what the best case could plausibly change. It would not instantly end the war. It would not remove the need for massive front operations. It would not prevent terrible losses, but it could do three realistic things. First, it could increase the speed of German operational failure in critical sectors by delaying reinforcement and resupply. Second, it could increase the chaos of German retreats by disrupting transport and communications behind them. Third, it could raise the cost of occupation so high that rear security consumes a larger share of German strength earlier than it did. Those are not fantasies. Those are plausible shifts in timing, cohesion, and capacity, and in war, timing and cohesion often matter more than slogans. Now, let's tie the what-if paths into one narrative arc. If you are watching this as a viewer, you do not want a lecture. You want a story that builds. So here is the arc as one continuous chain. In the early period, the partisans are born out of encirclement, refusal, and survival. In the middle period, they evolve into pressure, learning to strike rail lines, depots, and administration, learning to depend on networks rather than luck. In the later period, they become a timing weapon. They are used, in the best case, to strain the enemy rear exactly when front offensives demand maximum enemy flexibility. Now, imagine the best-case version of that later period. A headquarters has enough radios to keep a region connected. Intelligence is good enough to identify which junctions matter most. Demolition teams are trained enough to work quickly and repeatedly. Supply drops are sufficient to reduce predation on villages, increasing legitimacy and support. Counterintelligence is tight enough to reduce catastrophic infiltration losses. Under those conditions, the partisan movement does not merely exist. It becomes predictable in its unpredictability. It becomes a constant threat that forces the enemy rear to behave like a man constantly flinching. If the enemy rear is flinching during a major offensive, the front becomes brittle. That is the best case. Now, I will not pretend it was perfectly achieved, but I will also not downplay how close some regions came to something like it. The hidden heroes, finally seen clearly. I have spoken about systems and timing. Now I owe you the human center again, because without it this becomes sterile. The hidden heroes were not only the men placing charges. They were the people who made charges possible. The station worker who counted trains and risked everything to pass a schedule. The villager who hid a wounded fighter for 2 weeks while patrols searched. The courier who walked through snow with a message sewn into clothing. The radio operator who stayed calm while direction-finding units hunted signals. The local guide who knew which bog could swallow a pursuit and which path stayed firm after frost. The doctor who treated wounds with limited supplies, because the forest did not offer hospitals. And yes, the commanders who learned the hardest lesson: if you lose discipline, you lose the war you are trying to fight. If you abuse civilians, you rot your own roots. This is where I speak without softness. Any partisan movement that behaves like a predator toward its own population is cutting its own throat. In the best-case scenario, the movement's discipline improves earlier, not because it makes a nicer story, but because it makes a stronger movement. Legitimacy is not decoration. Legitimacy is supply. The moral weight, handled honestly, it would be dishonest to describe this as pure heroism without cost. The Forest War was fought inside occupation, and occupation punishes. Civilians were terrorized, displaced, starved, forced into labor. Fear sat over everything. The partisans did not cause occupation brutality, but their presence often triggered harsher reprisals in the logic of the occupier. This is why the courage of civilians is central. Helping a partisan was not a political gesture in a safe city. It was a decision made under a threat that could fall on your entire household. When we call someone a hidden hero in this context, we mean someone who acted despite knowing the price could be unbearable. So, what did the partisans ultimately change? They changed the enemy's sense of control. They changed how many men the enemy had to divert to rear security. They changed the reliability of transport and routine. They changed the psychological climate of occupation. They turned occupied territory into contested territory. And when the main front began to roll west, that contested territory mattered. It mattered because it made retreat harder, resupply less stable, and administration less effective. If you want a single sentence that captures their strategic value, it is this: they forced the enemy to fight the war in more places than he could afford. The concluding thought experiment, one final best-case question. Now, I am going to give you the cleanest question to end this story with, because it ties everything together and leaves your audience with something sharp. What if the Soviet partisan movement had been treated from the start as a strategic arm equal in seriousness to a conventional formation, not equal in size, equal in planning? What changes? Radios and training arrive earlier in key regions. Sabotage becomes synchronized sooner. Legitimacy and discipline are enforced more consistently. The occupation is undermined not only by bullets but by routine disruption. German rear security consumes more resources earlier. German reserves arrive later more often. German operations lose tempo sooner. German retreats become chaotic sooner. The war's outcome may remain the same, but the timeline compresses. The cost distribution shifts. Some battles become less sustainable for the occupier. Some offensives stall earlier. Some encirclements fail sooner. Some regions are liberated with less time under the boot. That is the realistic best case, not magic victory, but a war that breaks the occupier's rhythm faster. And in a war of enormous distances, breaking rhythm is sometimes the closest thing to breaking an army. Bringing it back to the beginning, where this story belongs. When I began, I asked you to listen to the woods. To understand that the Eastern Front cannot be understood only by following tanks and infantry on open ground. Now we return to that same quiet. The hidden war did not have parade music. It had the crunch of snow under a boot that must not be heard. It had the smell of damp wood and cheap tobacco. It had the steady discipline of men who learned to move without leaving traces. It had the fear that never fully left, because safety was always temporary. And yet it also had an unexpected kind of strength, the strength that comes when ordinary people decide that occupation is not destiny. That decision, multiplied across forests and villages and rail yards, became a force. Not a neat force, not a clean force, but a real one. And if you want to honor the hidden heroes honestly, do not turn them into saints. Respect them as they were human beings operating under pressure, making impossible choices, and still finding ways to strike at a machine that claimed to be unstoppable. So, here is my closing line, the kind that sits with you after the lights go out. An occupier can count his divisions, his tanks, his trains. What he cannot easily count is the moment a people decides the rear will never be quiet again. Now I want to hear from you, because this is the argument that makes history alive. If you were planning a major offensive and you knew the forests behind you were hostile, what would scare you more, losing a battle at the front or losing control of the roads and rails that make your army possible? When I close the last page of this story, I do not hear cheering. I hear the quieter sounds that followed the Eastern Front into the post-war world. The sounds that never quite made it into the official parades. A train wheel striking a cracked seam in the track. A boot scraping mud from a doorway. A radio operator's fingers hesitating over a dial because even after victory, certain habits of caution do not leave you. We have spent our time in the places that history often describes only in footnotes. Not the grand avenues of capitals, not the formal conference rooms where borders were argued into new shapes, but the forests and rail yards and occupied streets where the war was fought by people who rarely expected to be remembered. The Soviet partisans did not win the war by themselves, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling legend, not history. But they did something that changed the logic of the conflict. They made occupation expensive. They made the enemy's rear uncertain. They turned routine into risk and forced an army built on movement and supply to live with hesitation. That hesitation mattered, and it carried forward. Because the post-war world that emerged from the rubble was a world that had learned the power of the unseen. Governments rebuilt with new security instincts. Borders hardened. Intelligence services expanded. The vocabulary of secrecy became normal, not exceptional. In the East, the memory of partisan warfare did not simply fade into nostalgia. It became a template. It taught states what a hidden network could achieve and taught occupiers what a population could do when it refused to stay quiet. But there was a cost to that lesson, and it is right to say it aloud. Secrecy protects operations, but it also buries lives. It turns courage into anonymity. It leaves families with stories they cannot safely tell, and it leaves survivors carrying names in their heads that never appear in public. Behind every successful act of sabotage there were reprisals, fear, betrayals, and the daily moral compromises of survival. Behind every celebrated operation there were smaller tragedies that never reached a report. That is the weight of clandestine war. It is effective, and it is unforgiving. If you step back and look at what we have traced, you see why the partisan story still matters today. It is not just a chapter of World War II. It is a reminder that history does not only move through speeches and armies. It also moves through networks, through ordinary people making extraordinary decisions under pressure, through the quiet defiance that turns a road into danger for an occupier and turns a timetable into a fragile thing. And now, at the end, I find myself returning to the image I began with, because it holds the entire story in one frame. A desk in a dim room. A few pages of typed notes. The ink still fresh enough to smell, as if the words were only just committed to paper. Somewhere outside, a corridor that does not echo with celebration, only with the soft, practical footsteps of people who have learned to keep moving. I push the chair back. I gather the pages. And for a moment, I let the silence sit, because silence is part of what these men and women lived with and part of what they left behind. There is a temptation, when the story ends, to make it neat, to declare that the heroes were pure, that the enemy was simple, that the war had clear borders even in the shadows. But the truth is more human and more lasting than that. The hidden heroes of the Eastern Front did not live in neat lines. They lived in choices. They lived in the narrow gap between survival and resistance. They lived long enough, in many cases, to see a new world rise from the ruins, and they carried with them the knowledge that wars are often decided as much by what happens behind the lines as by what happens at the front. And I will admit, even after all this time, the topic still leaves me with the same reaction, a kind of sober wonder, because once you understand what the partisans did, you cannot look at the Eastern Front the same way again. You start asking different questions. You start listening for the hidden war beneath the loud one. So, here is one direct question for you, and I want you to answer it in the comments. If you were the commander of an occupying army, what would frighten you more, a defeat at the front or a rear that never stays quiet? Thanks for watching! If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated on our uploads.